whatever role you have, I mean, whether you're trying to get a child to do something, a parent to do something, a client, right? It's all about influence, right? It's all about how do you convince someone, get their buy-in. And if they don't see it, if they don't see what you're saying, it's very hard to get them to say, hey, I agree with that, or let's do it, right? So I break it down into 4 different categories. So I talk about it as the first category is using visual imagery and drawing. So basically pictures, whether you use a PowerPoint slide or image from a magazine or you sketch something out, that's category 1, is visual imagery. Category 2 is the use of mental models and frameworks. That could be an org chart, right? If you think about that as an HR person, your org chart is a visual model of representation of the reality of who reports to who and who has what jobs, right? So process diagrams and maps. Maps are an example of a mental model, right? A map of London or a map of the New York subway system is going to help you get around by conceptualizing what the physical reality is, right? So that's category 2. Category 3 is the use of metaphor and analogy, comparing one thing to something else, right? So if I use a baseball analogy with someone from the UK, it may not resonate. A soccer/football analogy may go over better, right? So thinking of metaphors and analogies that resonate with your audience is key, because a good analogy will create clarity. A bad one will actually cause more confusion, right? So that's metaphor analogy. And the 4th category is storytelling, and you get extra points if you combine storytelling with humor. And I'm not talking about jokes. I'm talking about finding the humor in everyday life and in everyday work. So those are the 4 categories. They're not mutually exclusive. When used in combination, you could have a visual image that's accompanied by a story. You could have a mental model where you use a metaphor to explain it, right? So you could use these all in combination. But if you break it down to these 4 categories, it kind of gives you a menu of options from which to choose. So that's kind of how I break it down. And the first 2, the imagery and the models, are more tangible because those are things that we typically see with the physical eye. Storytelling and metaphor are more intangible because those could be communicated verbally without any pictures, right? So if you're listening to this podcast, just the sound without any images, you're processing, you may be hearing these stories and picturing them in your mind's eye,
yes,
just as if you were listening to something on the radio versus watching something on television.
Yeah, I used to use a lot of those techniques when I was in sales.
Yeah.
You know, imagine yourself driving down the road with the rooftop down in that new car,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Knowing that the client on the other side is like thinking about the wind in your hair. How would that make you feel? And then, you know, and then sort of mixing the feelings and emotions with the visual.
You may try to sell someone a car based on how many, horsepower and how fast in the engine and all the technical stuff. What sells a car, right, is that feeling that you're going to get when you're driving it. It's not what's under the hood. It's how you feel when you're behind the wheel. And one of the classic examples of that, for example, communicating numbers. HR people have to communicate numbers all the time, right? So if you start just talking about percentages, you put people to sleep and it may not resonate. Well, if you tell a story behind it or use an analogy that resonates with your audience, you're going to get a lot further. So like a classic example is when Steve Jobs introduced the iPod. Instead of saying this holds 5 gigabytes of data, means nothing. If you say this holds 1,000 songs in your pocket, that's amazing, right? My whole CD collection can fit on that little thing. That's unbelievable. Who cares about how many gigs it holds? It's the carrying your music around with you is what sells the product, right? So that's like a classic example of how you could translate statistics and data into language and imagery that's meaningful to your audience.